Apple is asking themselves the same questions that Oculus did, right? 5 years later. I think they will have. I think it's very clear that they have different answers. The question is, are they the right answers?
The VR Report podcast with David Gene O.
But his name is Bernard Yee. He's the CEO and founder of Windup Minds. Bernie, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Do you mind sharing your background and your origin story with the audience?
Sure. This is going to date me. I remember going into a Radio Shack in a mall in Queens, and there was a TRS-80, an early computer, sitting in the display area, and it said, "What's your name?" And I typed in Bernie, and it said, "Hi, Bernie, let's play blackjack." And it took me through a little blackjack game, and I could not believe what I just did. I mean, literally, those things felt like they were from the movie screen to my Radio Shack. So I begged my parents to get me a TRS-80. And like good Asian parents, of course, will spend money on something for education. Not ski lessons, but a computer, sure. So they bought me a TRS-80. I taught myself how to program. I taught myself how to write games. I spent a lot of time like typing in source code from magazines. There was something called Soft Talk, I think, which is a magazine that used to publish, source code for games. So I copied, I wrote, I modified, I started writing my own games. And it was super gratifying. I taught myself computer programming. But back then, I had a peer group of age, like people like Carmack and Romero, Richard Garriott, and I'm clearly not Carmack or Richard Garriott. I didn't realize that you could make a living doing this, where obviously they did. So I went to school. I got a degree in political science. I got a degree in law. It turns out, being a lawyer is a lot like being a programmer. You take rules, you try to wrestle them to your will. Instead of a compiler, you have like a court of law as your runtime. And I found that really gratifying, but ultimately I still love games. I was laid off in a recession, and I thought, do I want to be a big firm lawyer? Or do I want to kind of focus on games? And I'd started writing freelance game reviews for magazines, and I was like, I'm going to go back all into games. I started as a journalist. Because I had a little bit of a Wall Street business background, I got tapped to be an analyst, for Lehman Brothers. We're doing a lot of research on the gaming industry. And from there, I got into the business side, on the publishing side, and then I got into the development side. And kind of my big thing that happened was, at some point, I sat at GDC next to a friend of mine, Chris Butcher, who was an engineering lead at Bungie. And I was living in New York at the time. And I thought, I had been a big fish in a small pond in New York for a long time, and I wanted to go and be a small fish in a big pond. And I said to Chris, anything happening at Bungie? And he said, maybe. And I left New York, moved to Seattle to work at Bungie. Then I went to PopCap, and then Oculus. And the rest is history.
And you have such a great breadth of experience with immersive gaming, of course, with your experience with EverQuest, and as well as Rockband. Rockband was the first real immersive video game where you can have drums, a singer, guitar, and play as a real rock band. And you've seen the industry change as well with immersive experience and how they evolved from the early days. What do you compare the traditional early days of gaming to where it is now with the VR AR landscape?
It's interesting because I actually think of Rock Band Guitar Hero as like the first VR game. Because if you think VR is a way of playing a game where your body is actually doing the things the game wants you to do, right? Instead of holding a controller and pressing A to fire, you're actually doing the thing. In a lot of ways, Rock Band and Guitar Hero were the first VR games. I think my thought about this is, it's not that I'm deeply innovative in my thinking. How I think about this is I try to pattern match what I understand and apply to where we are today. And I think of evolution as a model of how games change over time. At some point, the world was ruled by dinosaurs, right? And you had these little mammals kind of hanging out, squeaking out in their existence, not, maybe not being big enough to threaten the dinosaur, but having some unique things that they could do that dinosaurs couldn't. And eventually, we know what happened, right? These little rodents became us, and the dinosaurs were gone. So I like to think about looking at the outliers. What is underfoot that's not getting attention, that is showing unique traits of adaptability and resilience, even when they're not the main life form, right? Like dinosaurs are the main life form. They're eating the plants. They're killing the brontosaurus. They rule the world. But here are these other things taking an orthogonal path, right? And I think about MMOs, and they started out as MUDs. And I'll add that a lot of the early indications tend to get dismissed as like weird, right? I'll give an example of how I felt this way. LAN parties. I never participated in LAN parties. I was like, these people are taking their PCs and their 24-inch CRT monitors and they're going to a room to play a game. This is crazy talk. And now the internet is one giant LAN party, right? So part of how you know a thing is an interesting outlier is when it challenges your perceptions of what games are. So I think about MMOs really started in the text MUDs, right? Text MUDs were going multi-user dimensions, multi-user dungeons. Richard Bartle wrote quite a bit about this. They were doing text games with people when we were in 3D game worlds. And we're like, oh, these people, what are they doing? They're the weird, neck beards of games. Turns out they were onto something like deeply social and interactive that games had not yet done. And you think about rhythm games, there's a great scene in one of my favorite movies, Lost in Translation, when Scarlett Johansson is walking around, like, I would assume Akihabara, and she sees like a young Japanese youth with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, playing a fake guitar music game. Music games were bigger in Japan than before they hit here. And you're like, the whole point of including that in that movie was that the director, Sofia Coppola, I think, wanted to show how both familiar and how alien Japan was, right? Here's a punk rock kid, but he's playing a video game, but it's rock and roll. And I think it's a really interesting thing. Like, to me, that's an interesting signal. So I think this sort of relies on having, for lack of a better word, taste. Like, you're looking for qualitative signal. You're not looking from the Facebook side of like, I want data to prove this. You want to kind of rely on first principles, fantasies that people have of how they spend their time, and have some conviction before you have data. So that's what I think about, like, when I look back on Ultima Online, EverQuest, World of Warcraft, Guitar Hero, Rock Band. The things that let those happen were largely present, but very few people noticed, except for Ralph Koster from Ultima Underworld, who ran a MUD, Brad McQuaid on EverQuest, who ran a MUD, Harmonix, who were really immersed in playing music professionally or at a high level in an amateur sense. Like, they kind of understood something. They saw something that was a precursor to something gigantic, right? And they bet on it, which I thought was, it's brilliant. And it's, we look back and we say, like, wow, how did they know? And like, this is how they know.
Yeah, and I think being able to catch that spark of what is being done in the popular culture and figuring out from a game developer's point of view, how do you take that experience and make it interactive, make it fun, first of all, and then design experience around it? I mean, Windup also is doing something really fresh and different, where there's a lot of stuff happening in the ether around artificial intelligence, and you decided, hey, look, there's something fun and interactive that we can't do before, that the technology wasn't able to provide. What was that genesis? And can you tell people about your thesis about Windup Minds and this new project that you're working on?
Yeah, I don't want to give away too much, but one of the things that's easy to see in our thesis was all the stuff that we had done at Oculus, right? I remember when we put on the first Crescent Bay which was the precursor to the Rift. It was like, it's like you're putting a blindfold on. It's completely dark. And then you're in this world, kind of a flat plane. You couldn't see your hands because we didn't have touch controllers yet. You couldn't see your body. You were the sort of disembodied eye in this space. And it's really disorienting. Like I think it is not, it's not what I would call user-friendly experience. And to the credit of the team around me, we thought, well, let's put someone in the space with you. And this is something that I think the Valve room originally explored a little bit of. In this case, the thing in the room with you is the turret bot, and that's a little bit scary. So we wanted to lean away from that a little bit. So we built these experiences that had an alien and a dinosaur, and that was Dream Deck. I think our art director, an incredibly talented artist named Kenneth Scott, wanted to do the Spielberg 3, alien, shark, dinosaur. And I think Sony had a shark, so we're like, okay, well, let's just do the dinosaur and the alien. And we found like that people really loved being in the room with the alien. It was a little bit off-putting, but the alien sort of looked at you and waved. And then, of course, the dinosaur was quite scary. So I think a lot of that began this long exploration of what is it like to be in VR with another presence that is impossible. An alien, a dinosaur, a fairy, an elf, whatever it is, a robot. And I think that we found that was deeply compelling to people. I can't tell you how many folks inside Oculus and Meta were like, I love Toby, the robot from First Contact. I'm like, no, I like it. Monty, the robot from First Steps. Like they really, we have, I have gotten fan mail about it, some really deeply moving fan mail about it, about BOGO, our virtual pet. So I think that there's something there, and I have a thesis on this, that really appeals to fundamental human need. And I think our thesis for a virtual pet comes from research that we are hardwired to love dogs and pets, because wolves adapted, they evolved to become dogs, which is much more human friendly. Like dogs are a human friendly form of a wolf. But if wolves evolved to be closer to us, it's a fair hypothesis to say that humans evolved to be closer to wolves. Because it's not a one-way street. It's not like they changed and we just stayed the same. Like we also genetically evolved. So there's something deeply moving, I think, about a puppy or a kitten. We're not just because they're cute and they have big eyes, but because they appeal to some fundamental humanity that we have, right? Some fantasy, some player fantasy. And that's what we want to capture. I don't think it's easy. I think it sounds easy. And like all great games, the ones that sound easiest are the hardest ones to build. But that's how we got on this path. And I saw a lot of this from feedback on all the experiences we built at Oculus in the early days. Dream Deck, Toybox, BOGO, First Contact, First Steps. Those are very, really well-loved experiences. You go on Reddit and almost no one hates them, which is, how'd that happen? Because it really speaks to something really powerful, right? And if you've seen anyone demo First Steps and you watch them start dancing, you cannot help laugh in like joy to watch people dance. So, and dancing is not a thing that people easily do, right? Like I go to weddings and, my wife has to drag me on the dance floor because I'm a little bit self-conscious. But when people put on the headset, even people like me start dancing. Like how, I can't explain it. I think there's lots of theories about cognitive identity and wearing a mask and feeling safe, but I dance in headset more than I dance with my wife at weddings. So there's something very powerful there. And I think that's the area I'm interested in exploring, not necessarily, doing an MMO in VR, or doing a first-person shooter, both of which I've worked. I worked on Destiny, I worked on EverQuest. I've seen those things, right, and they're very powerful. But that's not what calls me to VR, AR, mixed reality, spatial computing.
I love that. You said a lot of things that I was nodding, and agreeing with. With animals, I think what you said was very poetic. Animals didn't just evolve, but we also evolved, probably because we had to take care of this animal that's not even human, not even our species, not even remotely part of our tribe. So that was cool. But I think you're also underselling some of the projects that you worked on. We worked together at Meta. You were focusing on the new hand tracking when we were working together and launching that. Things like First Contact, where you had the first experience with almost like a Wall-E Pixar character, and having that emotional connection. And you're also in Toybox. That was another experience where you're just interactive and playing, but in a social context. These are like groundbreaking things, like you said, in the early days of Oculus, because it really showed what the benefits of VR were than anything other medium. You can actually feel presence, and you can also interact almost with these virtual beings as if they're real. So a lot of research, a lot of mind share went into getting those experiences right. And the takeaway from all of that, you're saying, hey, look, there's something really cool about these virtual beings, and trying to interact with them in those magical ways, like we talked about with all those other experiences that you worked on, can be really gratifying and really cool.
Yeah. No, thank you. I mean, it's as a producer, you're always looking ahead, and I guess I need to do a little bit better job of talking about what we did. But Toybox was very impactful, right? We built that internally. It was never meant to ship. Another team actually took the code base and actually made a real product out of it. And I don't have firsthand information of this, but I was told that Mark Zuckerberg spent a lot of hours in Toybox. He found it, I think, really compelling because it was a social proof, right? I wish I'd gotten a chance to talk to Mark about it as one of the leads of the team that built it. But he found it. I'll tell you a funny story. My manager, an executive who I really looked up to, Laura Fryer, was in Toybox, and the other person was the product lead, Brandon Dillon, and they were in the space together. And Laura said, "Hold my hand." And Brandon, I was watching this. Brandon's like, his response was, "I can't do that. I'm married." So it was really fascinating. It was funny because we all cracked up, but it's funny because it felt personal and intimate, like so much so that you can't do it because there's social taboo about holding someone's hand who you're not when you're romantically involved with someone else, even though you're just sort of sitting there and being like, right, you're not holding anyone's hand, right?
That's right.
But it's deeply emotional, right? Because it's a sense of embodiment. Like it is in fact my hand, and that is your hand, and we're holding it. Like if you talk about what VR does well, that's a great example of something that VR or AR, anything else can do that no other medium can do. Like it's not press X to hold hand, right? Which you could do in Eco in the video game. Like it just feels like a thing you do and you press X for, right? So it's cognitively very different and was very powerful. I think Toybox also, I think I wish that I had gotten a chance to talk to Mark about this but what Toybox doesn't do that MMOs do is create a set of incentives that guide social behavior. Like in Toybox, anything goes. You can do anything if the simulation allows you to. I can go out in the world and do anything that the simulation allows me to now, right? I could run around naked. I could go into a bank and be like, "Give me all your money." I could say crazy things, but I don't do them because there are rules in place that kind of suggest what I should do and give you penalties about what you shouldn't do. And that to me is what a game is, right? So I would have loved to build a Toybox with social design, game design, like an MMO, essentially an MMO, right? An MMO tells you you're a tank. You're going to be much better if you get a healer and a wizard. Like the three of you are going to go progress faster than any one of you alone. And those are rules, right? Those are rules to drive cooperation. And Toybox has none of that, right? And I think social worlds have to have some game design around it, because our real world around us actually has game design around us, kind of guiding us and telling us like what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And sometimes you break what we should do and you do something really cool, and the rules change to include that. I mean, there are a lot of examples of social change that are really about that, right? About Black people going into sitting anywhere they want on the bus, right? They broke a social rule, and then the rules changed to encompass that. So I think it's really powerful to have and to know that you have to build rules. And Toybox didn't do that. It was really like a demo just to prove multiplayer social space, right? We didn't get to explore any of that. That was one of the things I would have loved to have done more of, right?
Well, I think those early days were just kind of teaching you the fundamentals or the mechanics of how to interact. But I think even with Toybox, you would even say that, you know, the evolution of that is walkabout mini golf.
Yeah,
you know,
sure.
you're doing that one thing, which is that, you know, mechanic of swing a club, but the real interaction is just being able to talk and hold things and being able to point things with your club in your hand and having different views of the camera.
Yeah.
You know, there's so many different ways that you have to reimagine traditional gaming. You have such a wealth of experience of understanding spatial computing. How do you make that fun? What do you think are like the 3 tenets of trying to make a 2D game, a genre, for example, and trying to make it fun spatially? Like, what are those 3 rules that Bernie's deciphered?
Oh, I mean, I can't say that I deciphered them. I worked with some really talented people, right? And if anything, my talent was listening to them and asking them questions about why they thought this way, so I could sort of incorporate their thinking. But I think there are a few things that are interesting and different than maybe mobile and console games. One of them I think shares a lot in common with immersive games like Dishonored or BioShock, is emergent behavior, right? That you want lots of systems interacting to give rise to interesting outcomes. And I would say for VR, those systems often mean things should behave the way you expect them to. I'll give you an example. In Apple's video, marketing video, I wrote about this a little bit on my LinkedIn profile. In Apple's marketing video, they have this little vignette where a butterfly lands on your finger, right? But it was a real butterfly. Like, it looked like a real butterfly. My team did the same thing, but with a holographic butterfly. And there's a reason, right? We didn't just think it was cool. We thought if you present the player or the user with a thing, it should behave the way it presents itself as. So with a real butterfly, you should be able to pick it up, and if you're like a sadist, pull the wings off. Because people will do that, right? Gamers will do things. If you have a holographic butterfly, you can't do any of that. Your hand goes through it, right? So we built a thing that behaves in the way you'd expect it to. And I think that that's actually quite important. And in some ways, like the journey of that, how you turn it into something VR, I used to refer to the movie called The Prestige. It was about magicians. It's fantastic. But they say there are 3 parts to a magic trick. The pledge, which is, here's the thing, here's the ball I have, right? The turn, which is when you do something magical to it, right? Oh, it disappears. And the prestige, which is the big payoff, right? It is. And here it's back now it's in your pocket, right? So they can take a thing, they do something cool with it, and then they kind of really subvert your expectations. And you can't subvert expectations without providing a baseline. So I feel like a lot of VR is about providing the baseline. Here's the world, here's what you think it is. And, like books like The Chronicles of Narnia. Yes, but this closet in your room does something different. And then you go into that world and like, okay, not only is it a different world, you're the hero of this world, right? Like it builds on this sort of sense of reality, and VR is really built on reality. The second thing I think that I like to think about is, and again, this is my own bias, is quality, right? Our teams really polished the things we had. And this is an extension of things should behave the way you expect them to. So instead of having 50 objects in the world that behave like one way. We want like 4 objects in the world, but they behave exactly the way you want them to. Like in First Contact, you could take a ball, and if you're good enough, you could throw it into the trash can, right? Because they're physics containers, like you expect to do it, and it's not that easy to do. But when you do it, it acknowledges, like a little confetti blow happens. So quality is about leading into those moments. And the other thing I think is that, I can say my team did was we reevaluated how we think about like what's critical. So for our team, we went against kind of conventional wisdom when we started it. We didn't hire an artist as our first hire. We art hire. We hired an animator because if you want to believe a virtual pet is real, it better move like a real one, right? I mean, we will hire an artist also, but it's be willing to like adapt conventional wisdom of how do you make a game to things that are really important to you, right? And when you only have a finite budget, and we raised a pre-seed round, we couldn't hire everyone we wanted right away, nor should we, right? Who's the most important for this thing? Is it a concept artist? Is it an art director? Or is it an animator? And we made the decision we're going to hire an animator, right? Because we thought that was the right thing to do. And it is not, I don't think a lot of consoles companies would or should do that model. But for us, it was really critical. So really like understanding the needs of your product and acting accordingly. Because it's very hard to act against conventional wisdom.
100%. I think the biggest challenge that I've faced or witnessed with other game developers developing for XR or spatial computing is the sense of breaking presence, whether that's making the player feel uncomfortable, or as you had stated, hey, I know exactly how a specific creature may look, and you made sure your first hire was an animator to get that feeling right, because if it wasn't, it takes you out of presence, right? The control scheme just may, we don't have the liberty of like a set hand controller in your hand where you have some liberties of physics not feeling right, or if the movement, teleporting just kind of feels wonky, like those type of things matter. This like 10x more so in an immersive environment. And those are all the challenges of AR VR development. How do you think like comfort and controls and those things have to be reevaluated as a game developer when developing for XR?
That's interesting.
Getting it right.
I mean, I want to say, by the way, our choice to hire an animator wasn't like my idea. Michael Abrash said early on in our Oculus days that animation and audio would be far more important in VR than they were in console games. And I've always remembered that. And I think that that's true because we are sensory beings and we take audio cues and movement cues, deeply, like from a lizard brain standpoint. So this is a little bit controversial, right? I think there is an early adopter audience. Well, I don't think it's not controversial to say that right now VR isn't at the market size we want it to be, right? And it's largely been driven by a group of early adopters. And right now, I think a lot of those games have stick motion, right? And they're shooters. And there are games that are shooters that have made a lot of money and been very successful. If you look at the history of video games, are the genres that are successful initially the ones that are become durable over time? I think, it's hit or miss. I think some players are willing to put up with motion sickness to get a fantasy they want. I think there's some belief that when you're a younger player, you're less prone to motion sickness than when you're older.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, I think we should widen the top of the funnel to build experiences that the maximum number of people can enjoy. So if motion sickness, which apparently also there's a theory that it hits women more than men. There's actually, I've heard it hits Asians more than non-Asians. If there's anything that shrinks the funnel, do you want that if you're trying to grow the audience? Like, even though you shrink the funnel, you get all these players who are willing to put up with it. Is it better to keep the funnel broad, wider at the top? And I personally think the answer is yes. What is the first organic hit of VR that felt like that came from VR?
I think Tilt Brush, even though people
No,
say
I mean,
the
I'm thinking about
hit-wise
game.
was
I'm
Beat
thinking about
Saber.
games. Beat Saber,
Yeah.
right? Is there any locomotion in Beat Saber?
No.
No. 100% of the people that buy a headset can play Beat Saber. They may not like it, right? That's a question of taste. But 100% of the people that buy that device can play it. And I think that's really powerful. I love Resident Evil. I love Resident Evil 4. I think it's a great game. I think it's a great VR adaptation. It is very hard for me to play with stick motion because I'm very motion sick prone. So I feel like that's the comfort thing, right? Is that it should be comfortable to everyone. I think there will always be a genre of people that will like they want to play shooters, and they will put up with stick motion. But I don't know if this is going to be the dominant genre when we look back in VR as mainstream, 100 million, 200 million people using VR, whether that's going to be the kind of game that people play. I mean, back in the early days of PC games, NASCAR, IndyCar racing, like they were super popular. Combat flight simulators, F-16, Aces over the Pacific, I think, like super popular. Are they still popular? I don't know. I mean,
but not as much, because I think in what you're saying is in the early days, I guess we would consider those controls and camera like with those type of the fighter jet.
And the audience was really like, it was a different audience.
That's right.
A different
that
kind
audience
of person.
Was really into it.
Right, who's really into
early
it.
Adopter.
Right.
And what you're saying is that, hey, we're going to probably evolve from that because we're getting new audience members getting into VR. A lot of them, they're younger. What I really appreciate about the idea of an AI virtual pet is that there's always going to be a need, if you believe in that pet, to want to take care of it on a daily basis, right? You're going to want to take care of it, want to love it, want to make sure that it's fed and taken care of. You want to check in on it, right? But maybe not have all the problems of having a real pet, like having to actually walk physically outside when it's raining, or having to take care of when it's sick. Yeah.
Like, again, it's the fantasy of the pet. It's not the actual, like, if I want a real pet, I have a real pet. Real pets require space, time, money, and not everyone can have that, right? So I think that's very powerful. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is sort of getting into the core value proposition, but I think we are offering a virtual pet offers something really fundamental to the human experience that first-person shooter does not, I hope. I mean, I would rather take care of things than shoot things, and I hope most people feel this way. So I think that there's something really powerful there. I think I kind of pose this as a hypothetical. Do we ever think that shooters in VR will be as big as shooters in console? Like, is it going to be as big as Call of Duty or Half-Life or Halo? Because I think if shooters were the killer app for VR, we wouldn't be having this discussion, right? It would already have been like, this is it. This is what everyone wants. They want it more on VR than they want it on their console. I think the market has said that's not, first-person shooters are not the killer app for VR, right? Yeah. But you're increasing the funnel. You're decreasing the funnel size again, right? I live in a house now as opposed to when I lived in New York City, and I don't know if I have room for a treadmill. And I live in a house that by New York City standards would be considered a palace. But I don't know if I have room for a treadmill. Like, that's the thing, is like you're decreasing you're cutting the funnel off, right? And I get it. And I think, I think a first-person shooter is a killer app for console. I think it can be a very profitable. It is a very profitable genre in VR and AR and maybe AR. But and again, if you move to mixed reality, like, how good is a shooter in mixed reality, right? Like, yeah, I don't know. So I think that there's something, like I said, I think I have one of my kind of theories is VR. Console games is a power fantasy, right? If you look at how fast Master Chief runs in Halo, he's running like Usain Bolt speeds because you really want to feel that heroism. And if AR is a power fantasy, maybe if console games are a power fantasy, then maybe VR is I call it the fantasy of the small space, like the details, right? If Superman can leap over buildings with a single bound, Batman pays attention to everything around him.
Right.
Right? So maybe that's the difference, right? Is that Superman console, Batman MR spatial.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
I used to say, and I said this, I had this in the deck that the Facebook PR people made me cut, but Gone Home could be the Call of Duty for VR. Right? It's not. It is kind of this. It follows my mammal analogy. Like it's successful enough to be noticed and popular on 2D platforms, but maybe that's the formula, right? Is that in VR, MR, it's so much more powerful to feel like you're in the house and you're coming upon these artifacts of the story. It feels like it's really happening to you. Right? Maybe that's
Right.
the model, right? And this is really not meant as a literal thing. It's meant as a thought experiment.
Sure.
Right? That's how I feel about where VR is going. I could be completely wrong.
No, I'm in agreement with that. I think these are the early days of even mixed reality because it's, incorporating the camera sensors to incorporate your real world environment into a virtual setting. But, obviously I want to have beings or pets or friends, virtual pet friends in my real environment, right? And I think that's something where mixed reality, that's the only way to really have that experience until we get to AR where it feels really comfortable and it's accessible. It's going to be mixed reality of having things in your real environment. What do you think is the future for mixed reality? And do you think mixed reality is the future for XR?
I'm going to answer that last question first. I do think it's the future. When we did our initial user research for Rift, we found that people found it quite disconcerting to put on a headset and see nothing but black. And I remember that women felt more uncomfortable with that because, when you're a woman, you certainly don't want to feel vulnerable in any space, right? So there's some gender issues that I think are worth thinking about. When you put on the Quest 3, which I think is a spectacular piece of hardware, and Meta laid me off, so I don't have to boost them or anything, but I'm happy to call out great hardware. Like you put on the headset and the pass-through is fantastic, and you don't feel blinded to the world, right? And same with Apple Vision Pro, I assume. That user experience already, I think, is an order of magnitude better for the user than VR. I think mixed reality makes things better. And the other thing too is like hand tracking. Even though hand tracking isn't as accurate and has no haptics as the controller, again, the funnel, right? You can start interacting with the world right away. Because if you think about traditional analytics, the more clicks you have, the more a thing is buried under clicks, the worse your retention is. Because at every stage of the funnel, you're losing someone. So if I can put on my headset, see, the store, see notifications, start an app, maybe start playing with it just with my hands. And I'm like, oh, you need the controller. You're already in the game. You're like, oh, my controller is there, right? Because, in theory, your headset should know where your controller is at any time, especially if you awaken it, right? Like, oh, it's the controller. Let me pick it up and I'll do this now. But you already have the person in the game experience, which means they're more likely to continue, I think, than like, oh, I need my controller. Do I really need to do I need my controller to open my notifications? Oh, David is playing this game. I'll join with him. Like if I don't see that notification, you'll have lost me in the funnel, right? I mean, this is like pretty basic mobile game funnel analytics.
Sure.
So like, I think hand tracking and mixed reality, like they keep the funnel open wider, longer. So I think it's absolutely the future. I think it's a better user experience. I think it's a better retention experience. Um, I think, the kinds of games that work in mixed reality are going to be different than the ones that work in virtual reality, right? Because, again, I have like my office. Do you want to play a game in here? It's a good question. It's pretty messy. So there are a lot of rethinking in the same way that console games had to rethink to go to VR. I think VR has to rethink to go to mixed reality, right? And I think that that's going to happen, but it will happen.
What are your thoughts on Apple Vision Pro? I think that's a good segue. Considering, Meta Quest 3, perfect, awesome product for mixed reality. I think affordability. Mark recently talked about encapsulating the Android experience of XR. It will be with Quest. What do you think of Apple Vision Pro, and are you going to be supporting it?
That's a good question. I'm obviously happy that they're in the market because I don't think Apple is here to sell $3,500 headsets for the foreseeable future. Like I think they want to see this replace the iPhone, right? And the iPhone is a gaming, communications, world life navigating device, right? It's something we need. We tell ourselves we need to live. So I think that's what they want. I think that's what Meta wants also. So I'm really happy to have someone in the space. Again, I'm going to write a little bit more about this on my LinkedIn profile, but I suspect that Apple is asking themselves the same questions that Oculus did, right? 5 years later. I think it's very clear that they have different answers. The question is, are they the right answers? The thing I think I'm most watching for is how Apple treats games. I think that Oculus decided they really wanted to nurture games by funding them, by buying studios, by subsidizing them.
Content is king.
Right? Content is king, right? And it's interesting because Apple doesn't, and yet who owns movie studios and movie productions? Apple does.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
So there's an interesting tension there, and I have I think part of the reason is movies are so far outside the realm of Apple's expertise that they'll put money at it. But games are software, and they think, well, we made money off of games. I mean, they make a ton of money off of games on the iOS App Store, right? But we don't have to really get involved in it. They'll just build it. So I feel like the question I have is, will Apple be more hands-off, which I think is the current direction, on nurturing spatial games, not just Apple Arcade games on which I think is not real spatial computing, right? Like is spatial computing really a screen that in front of you? I think the answer is no, but I'm biased. So I think the question is like, will Apple really commit to games as a use case? And I feel like when you have a child, the first thing they do to figure out the world is play, right? They learn the vocabulary of their world, like stove is hot and, knife is sharp and book fall on foot hurts. Like they learn these things, hopefully in not a dangerous way, but they play with things, right? We play to understand the world. This is a fundamental human motivation. And then when we play enough, like then we can take things a little more seriously. You go to school, you get a job, you get married, maybe you have kids. Like all all these things grow in sort of utility, and people, I think adults forget to play. But before you have productivity and utility, I think you have play first. I'd love to see how Apple's going to land on this. I feel like they're kind of outsourcing play. But any parent knows you cannot outsource play. How you play with your child affects how they think of the world. And if platform holder is sort of the parent, right? They want you to these people to understand. You can't be like, okay, I'll go out in the backyard, take care of yourself. Like you have to kind of guide them, right? With what you know before. So that's what I'm looking for Apple, right? I think, is Apple going to do that? I think the answer right now is, probably not, but don't hold us to it, right? Like they're still waiting and seeing. And I think, they are like my example of the butterfly. I think they chose something that was realistic because that's the obvious thing to do. And we chose the holographic because we thought a little bit more about it. And I said, look, I don't want someone, if I try to grab a real butterfly and it doesn't work, it's the uncanny valley. Like, oh, that's not a real thing at all. But if you try to grab a holographic butterfly and it doesn't work, you're like, ooh, these people think about like, this is a hologram, right? They're physical things and there's holograms. And in reality, they're all holograms. They're all generated, right? But like I think that's a different way of looking at it. And I don't know what Apple wants to do, but I think they're going to have some lessons they're going to learn. They're going to learn from it. I hope they spend more time.
I really
playing.
hope so. Yeah, I really hope so. I think I would hate for Apple Vision Pro not to support immersive gaming experiences, just like how Apple TV, I think, floundered on trying to be a console. It's really about reinvigorating that gaming experience to match what people are doing within that product, like an Apple Vision Pro headset. So I'm looking forward to a toy box that Apple would unveil. I really hope that they'd be able to do that. You went from you went from a lawyer to a game producer, making traditional games, working with some of the biggest gaming franchises in the world, to creating a lot of the innovative experience that most people love about VR with those early experimentations from Toybox, BOGO for the Oculus. What advice do you have for aspiring AR, VR developers or founders going into games today?
That's a good question. I think about as a if you're coming from a big company to a small company, I think you want to identify the people you want to work with, right? Who complement you, who aren't the same as you, who also believe in the vision. I think finding the right people is always a challenge. I used to say when Oculus became Facebook-y, Oculus in the early days, and I was there when there was 250 people, so it was not that early, but it was early enough that I think 99% of us believed in the vision. Like we were there and said, VR is going to change computing. And we believed it, right? And especially the people who were really there early when Oculus was much riskier really believed it, right? They kind of bet their career on it. I think the question now is, are people there who now really believe it or think of it as just a job? And I think when you become a founder and you want to recruit a team, you want to go back and find the people that really believe in it, right? I think that's something that's important. Then on the second point about what you build, and I think this is very hard to do because it puts you out of your comfort zone, is Ottman Binstock, who was one of the original Valve VR team leads and came over to Oculus with Michael Abrash. He and I spent a bunch of time together in the early days, and he is in the Valve team did a lot of exploration of VR interactions, right? Like they built hundreds
100%.
of prototypes, which I think very few companies have the patience to do. Like I don't know if Meta has the patience for that anymore.
Traditional game development, yeah,
right?
100% with you.
And the piece of advice he said to me, which has always stuck with me, is he said, Bernie, you should do the non-obvious. And that's always stuck with me. Like the obvious thing probably, like when does the obvious thing ever work? When you're making a huge shift, right? When is it really durable? Like it may be partially, it may have some staying
semblance,
power, but
and staying
not
power.
for long, right? So he felt like in his, I think a lot of his experience was like you should do the non-obvious, and that really stuck with me. Like dancing with a robot in first steps, not obvious, right? In some ways, like I'm super proud of that experience because people were so surprised, right? There was like you're in VR, what are you gonna do? You're gonna dance with a robot, like what? Right? And it was really powerful. Like people really loved it. So that's the thing I think about. And I think it requires, this implies that somebody has the sort of perspective and experience to gauge what is non-obvious,
Mm-hmm.
And that I think it's hard to do just like right out of the gate. Because for a lot of people, understanding what the non-obvious is means exploring the obvious.
Right.
And learning firsthand, like, yeah, I thought this was going to work, but it doesn't, right?
Right.
So I think that's a real challenge, right? Anything you can do to accelerate your understanding of the obvious and the non-obvious, I think that would be great.
That's great advice, because you were a first in a lot of things. Looking back, what are you most proud of all the breadth of work that you've done, and what would you have done differently now?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think in this time, I think it's really interesting I seem to have always stayed out of my comfort zone, but I can't say that is because of some positive trait in my character. Some of it's layoffs, right? Like I got laid off from Meta, and I thought, do I want to go work at a big company again, or is this a chance for me to take on something new? And but in some ways, that decision was kind of made for me, right? That question was asked for me. So I think being out of your comfort zone is really, as I'm very proud of. I think the two things I'm most proud of is obviously, I think, launching consumer VR. Very, very rarely do you have the chance to be there at the birth of a medium and have the things that you have helped ship, help define how people talk about the birth of the medium. Like, think about computers in space war, right? Like, who gets the chance to do that? I feel really fortunate. And from a breadth thing, I'm very proud of launching Plants vs. Zombies 2. I consider PvZ one of the great. Now, the original PvZ was one of the greatest games of all time. I feel like it was so elegant and so polished and so distilled. And to launch a game that I think lived up to that aesthetic, in a time that was very challenging because EA was pressuring PopCap to become more free-to-play. And we kind of tried to launch the least aggressive free-to-play game as we could and still be free-to-play. And that game has continued to make money for EA for the last 10 years, right? They're just now launching a PvZ 3. But that's not, the commercial success isn't even the big thing. Like the fact that so many people love that PvZ 2, it brought joy to so many people. That's something you don't get from VR, because PvZ 2 has reached hundreds of millions of people probably, right? So
That's right.
I having the ability to make so many people happy with something that you're really proud of, and the team that kind of came together at the end to ship that was a really solid group of people, and solid is like an understatement. I have very deep and fond feelings for my entire leads team, because we shipped something great together, and it was not easy. So and there's a lot of pressure because PvZ 2 was the franchise that PopCap was acquired for. So there's a lot of pressure on us. We delivered something that people really loved, and that's what I think those are the things that I'm really proud of.
I love that, Bernie. I had such a great time talking to you, and I learned a bunch. I really looking forward to all the great news of Windup Minds, and I'm sure game investors, you really need to talk to Bernie. He's got something really special going on, and I'm looking forward to hearing more updates, Bernie.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Thank you so much.
All right.